Hey, John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're taking a look at the cerebral cortex from a lateral perspective. And you can see towards the front of the cerebral cortex we have all these structures which we want to identify. So let's just jump right into it. So if we remember, we have towards the front of the cerebral cortex a structure known as the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe takes up this entire area right here. And it's divided from our parietal lobe back here by this sulcus right here. Now this is the central sulcus, and if you remember from our previous video, I told you can identify that central sulcus because it doesn't fully extend all the way to that lateral fissure, as you can see right here. So just anterior to that central sulcus, we're going to have that frontal lobe. And if we look here, here's going to be that central sulcus. Here is going to be our frontal lobe right there. Now, if we dive deeper into the frontal lobe, we can see that we have a number of specific gyri. So looking back at that central sulcus, if we move one gyrus over right here, we're going to have that precentral gyrus. So that precentral gyrus is going to be this one right here. And then we have these three gyri right here. And what I like to do is I like to take three fingers and just place them over that frontal lobe. Now, these gyri are kind of ambiguous. They're not as well defined as we would like them to be. But by placing three fingers, we can get an estimation of where they are approximately. So you can see right here, we'd have that superior, we'd have our middle right here, and then all the way down here, we would have our inferior frontal gyrus. Now, if we take a closer look, you can see we have these three structures right here. And these are going to be our pars opercularis, our pars triangularis, and our pars orbitalis. And so our pars opercularis is going to be this most superior and posterior gyrus right here. Our pars triangularis is going to be this triangular shaped one right here. And then the pars orbitalis is going to be that one closest to the orbit. It's going to be the most inferior and anterior. Now, to identify these, I always look for the pars triangularis because it's the most distinctive in its shape. And if we look right here, we can see this triangle shaped gyrus right here. So that's going to be our pars triangularis. And then we have the pars opercularis right here and the orbitalis down here. And now finally, we have Broca's area. So Broca's area is just a small region right here, and it's involving part of the pars triangularis and most of the pars opercularis. So we can identify that Broca's area would be roughly around right there. So now let's go and label these. So we start off, we have our frontal lobe. Then within the frontal lobe, we have our inferior frontal gyrus, we have our middle frontal gyrus, and our superior frontal gyrus. And then just anterior to the central sulcus right here, we have that precentral gyrus. And then if we go into this area down here, we have Broca's, we have pars opercularis, pars triangularis, and pars orbitalis. So now let's just verify these. We have that frontal lobe, that inferior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, superior frontal gyrus, our precentral gyrus, our pars opercularis, our pars triangularis, orbitalis, and of course, Broca's area. John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're taking another view of the cerebral cortex, again from the lateral perspective, but this time we're looking at the right cerebral hemisphere. And you can see we have all these areas within the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe that we want to identify. So let's just jump into it. So in order to distinguish our parietal lobe from our frontal lobe, we're going to take a look and find that central sulcus, which is going to be right here on both image. And remember that central sulcus doesn't extend all the way down, and this is going to separate our frontal lobe right here from our parietal lobe back here. We also have that parieto-occipital sulcus separating the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe back here, which can be found at this little notch, and just follow that up. So that's going to be the posterior limit of that parietal lobe. And to differentiate our temporal lobe from our frontal lobe, we're going to look at this lateral fissure right here and kind of just connect it to that parieto-occipital sulcus. And that's going to separate our temporal lobe from our parietal lobe and our frontal lobe. So here is that lateral fissure making that temporal lobe. We would have our parietal lobe right here, as well as our frontal lobe right there. So now let's take a closer look at the temporal lobe and see what kind of structures we can find. So similar to the frontal lobe, we have three gyri. We have the superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. And to identify these, you can use the three-finger method by placing three fingers over that temporal lobe. But in this area, the gyri are a little bit more distinctive. So you can see here would be that superior temporal, here would be that middle temporal, and then just tucked away down here would be that inferior temporal. Now we have the superior marginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. To find that superior marginal gyrus, you're going to want to follow that lateral fissure all the way up until you get to a point where it doesn't extend any further. And this area surrounding that upper aspect of that lateral fissure, that's going to be our supramarginal gyrus. Similarly, to find the angular gyrus, we're going to follow that superior temporal fissure all the way up to a point where you can't really extend any further. And then this region right here is going to be our angular gyrus region. Now the superior marginal gyrus and the angular gyrus are both found within the inferior parietal lobule, which we'll take a look at now. So going into our parietal lobe right here, it's going to be divided into three sections. We're going to have our postcentral gyrus, because here would be our central sulcus. This right here would have been our precentral gyrus. So behind that central sulcus, we're going to have that postcentral gyrus. And then posterior to that postcentral gyrus, we're going to have our inferior parietal lobule and our superior parietal lobule. So in order to identify that superior parietal lobule, you're going to want to find that parieto-occipital sulcus right around here. And then you're going to want to find another fissure passing through. This is going to be that intraparietal sulcus. So medially to that intraparietal sulcus, we're going to have our superior parietal lobule, and laterally to that intraparietal sulcus, we're going to have that inferior parietal lobule. So again, here's that postcentral gyrus right here. Here would be that inferior parietal lobule, and then we'd have that superior parietal lobule right there. So let's do a quick recap on what we just learned. Up here, we're going to have our parietal lobe. We're going to have our postcentral gyrus right here. We're going to have that superior parietal lobule and that inferior parietal lobule. And also found within that inferior parietal lobule, we're going to have that supramarginal gyrus, which is at the upper aspect of that lateral fissure. And we're also going to have that angular gyrus, which is at that upper aspect of that superior temporal fissure. And then finally, within our temporal lobe, we have that superior temporal gyrus, that middle temporal gyrus, and that inferior temporal gyrus. Now let's just confirm that we got everything right. So we got our parietal lobe, we have that postcentral gyrus, superior parietal lobule, inferior parietal lobule, we have that supramarginal gyrus, that angular gyrus, and then our three temporal gyri, the superior, middle, and inferior. John here from Anatomy Boot Camp, and in this dissection we're taking another view of the cerebral cortex from the lateral perspective. We're looking at the right hemisphere, and you can see we're focused on this posterior aspect right here. So let's just jump in there and identify these structures. So if we remember our lobes, we have our frontal lobe, which is going to be most anterior, and it's separated from our parietal lobe via the central sulcus. So here would be our parietal lobe. And then posterior aspect of the parietal lobe, we have that posterior occipital sulcus right here, which divides the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So this structure right back here, this is going to be our occipital lobe. And if we look for it on here, you can see there's a little notch right here, a little notch right here. So if we connect these two, we're going to have that occipital lobe right there. So now let's dive deeper into the occipital lobe and identify the occipital gyri. So you can see, similar to the frontal and the temporal, we have a superior occipital gyrus, a middle occipital gyrus, and an inferior occipital gyrus. And they're laid out like you would expect. Superior is going to be the most superior and medial. The middle is going to be found right there in the middle. And then the inferior is going to be the most inferior, as well as lateral. So what does this look like on this image? Well, again, we're going to find that parietal occipital sulcus. We're going to find that superior occipital gyrus right here. We'll find the inferior occipital gyrus right here. And then right there in the middle, we're going to have that middle occipital gyrus. So now let's get these labeled. We have that occipital lobe. We have the superior, middle, and inferior occipital gyri. So now let's confirm that. We got our occipital lobe, our superior occipital gyrus, our middle occipital gyrus, and our inferior occipital gyrus. John here from Anatomy Boot Camp, and in this dissection we're going to be identifying some of the major fissure and sulci which are present on the superficial surface of the cerebral cortex. This right here is looking at a lateral aspect of the cerebral cortex, specifically the right hemisphere, and you can see we have all these arrows pointing to these little creases within the cerebral cortex. So let's just jump in here and identify these. So first we're going to start off by identifying my favorite sulcus, which is the central sulcus, which is going to be this one right here, and you can see it on this image right here. So the central sulcus is going to split up the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and you can see surrounding the central sulcus we're going to have this long gyri. This is the precentral gyrus, and we're also going to have this long gyrus, which is the postcentral gyrus. So these two long gyri are going to be the indicators, and you're going to see that the sulcus doesn't fully extend. It has this connection, or this part of the gyrus, which prevents it from extending all the way down to this fissure right here, which is the lateral fissure. So that's how I identify the central sulcus. Next up, we're going to have that fissure, which I just mentioned. It's going to be that lateral fissure, and it's going to be found on that superior border of the temporal lobe, and it separates the parietal, frontal, and the temporal lobes. Next up, we have the transverse fissure, and this fissure is a little bit different than the other fissure in sulci, and that's specifically because it's separating the cerebral cortex superiorly and the cerebellar cortex inferiorly. So the transverse fissure is going to be that fissure found between the cerebellar cortex and the cerebral cortex. And while we're back here, we can identify this sulcus right here. It's going to be that parietal occipital sulcus, and it's named because it separates the occipital lobe from the parietal lobe right here. So that's that parietal occipital sulcus. And within our parietal lobe, which we can see right here, we have one more sulcus, and that's going to be that intraparietal sulcus, and it's going to be found a little bit more medial and superior, and it separates our superior parietal lobule from our inferior parietal lobule. It's a little hard to see from this angle, but right here would be that intraparietal sulcus. So again, we have that central sulcus right here between the frontal and parietal lobes. We have that lateral sulcus between the temporal, parietal, and frontal lobes. We have that transverse fissure between our cerebellar cortex and our cerebral cortex. We have this parieto-occipital sulcus between the occipital lobe and the parietal lobe. And finally, we have that intraparietal sulcus, which is going to be found between that superior parietal lobule and that inferior parietal lobule. So let's just get these named. So let's just confirm this. We got that central sulcus, that lateral fissure, our transverse fissure, our parieto-occipital sulcus, and our intraparietal sulcus. John here from Anatomy Boot Camp, and in this dissection we're going to be taking a look at the functional areas of the cerebral cortex. So we're looking at the cerebral cortex, the left hemisphere, from a lateral perspective. And we're going to start by talking about the structures of the frontal lobe. So I'm always going to go in and identify that central sulcus. This is my go-to. Just anterior to that central sulcus, this is going to be that precentral gyrus, and that precentral gyrus, that's going to be the home of of the primary motor cortex. Now, just anterior to that, we're going to have this small area up here. This is going to be that supplementary motor area, and it's found within that superior frontal gyrus. Just underneath that, we're going to have a little small area right here. This is going to be that frontal eye field. And the frontal eye field is actually within a larger area known as the premotor area. So that premotor area is going to expand around here. And then on the most anterior aspect of the frontal lobe, this is where we're going to have our prefrontal cortex, as you can see right here. And that prefrontal cortex, this is the one that's going to be involved in the more executive functioning, higher thinking. And of course, we can't forget our Broca's area. And that Broca's area is going to be made up of that pars opercularis and then half of that pars triangularis right there. So now looking posterior to that central sulcus and into that parietal lobe, we have that postcentral gyrus right here. And that postcentral gyrus, that is going to be the home of the primary somatosensory cortex. And then again, posterior to that, we have this large area back here. And this is going to be the sensory association cortex. And this is going to expand both the superior parietal lobule as well as the inferior parietal lobule. Now we're going to move down and go into the temporal lobe. We're going to first start by identifying Wernicke's area. And Wernicke's area can be found by identifying first the supramarginal gyrus, which is found right here, as well as the angular gyrus, which is found right here. So Wernicke's area is going to be sandwiched kind of just between the supramarginal and the angular gyrus, and it's going to be this little region right here. And then if we move just a little anterior and inferior, we have this region right here. This is going to be that primary auditory cortex. And then again, just anterior to that, we're going to have our auditory association cortex found right there. Now, if we look at the inferior temporal gyrus, right around here, kind of where it's close to the fusiform gyrus, we're going to have this area known as the fusiform face area. And this is involved in helping recognize faces that we're familiar with. Finally, moving to the most posterior aspect, we have the occipital lobe right here. And the most posterior pole of the occipital lobe is going to be that primary visual cortex, which is going to be found right here. And then kind of creating a shell around that, we're going to have the visual association area. And that's going to be this region right here. All right, awesome. So now that we've identified everything, let's go on and label it on this image right here. We're going to start off in this frontal lobe area. So we're going to have that primary motor cortex, the supplementary motor area, the premotor area, the frontal eye field, Broca's area, and the prefrontal cortex. And then moving posterior to that central sulcus, we're going to have that primary somatosensory cortex as well as that sensory association cortex. And then looking at the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's area, the primary auditory cortex, the auditory association cortex, as well as that fusiform face area. And then finally, in the occipital lobe, we have the primary visual cortex in the visual association area. All right, awesome. Now let's just verify all this. We got that primary motor cortex, that supplementary motor area, the premotor area, frontal eye field, Broca's area, and the prefrontal cortex. Looking at the parietal lobe, we have that primary somatosensory cortex and the somatosensory association area. Then in the temporal lobe, we have Wernicke's, we have auditory cortex and the auditory association area, as well as the fusiform face area. And then looking at the occipital lobe, we have that visual cortex, as well as that visual association area. John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're taking a look at the cerebral cortex from a posterior perspective. We have a number of structures which we want to identify. So the first couple structures are going to be the superior occipital gyrus, middle occipital gyrus, and the inferior occipital gyrus. And you see we've already been able to identify these from a lateral perspective. So let's take a look at it from a posterior perspective. Now the first thing that I would do is look for the parietal occipital sulcus, which is going to be found right here. And that's going to allow us to identify that anterior boundary of our occipital lobe right here. And then once we find this occipital lobe boundary, we can divide the occipital lobe into kind of 3 quadrants. So our superior occipital gyrus would be right here, our middle would be right here, and then inferior would be right down there. Next, let's take a look at this long fissure which separates our 2 cerebral hemispheres, the right and left cerebral hemispheres, and this is going to be our median longitudinal fissure. And you can see we have this dark valley towards the center, and here we would have our right and our left cerebral hemispheres. So that's going to be our median longitudinal fissure. Now we'll talk about our transverse fissure, and the transverse fissure is going to be that one which separates our cerebral cortex superiorly from our cerebellar cortex inferiorly. So that's going to be that transverse fissure. Great, so now let's just go and label these up. So starting in the occipital lobe, we're going to have that superior occipital gyrus, we're going to have our inferior occipital gyrus, and our middle occipital gyrus. Sitting between our 2 cerebral hemispheres, we're going to have that median longitudinal fissure. And then found between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellar cortex, we're going to have that transverse fissure. Awesome. So now let's just go and verify these. We have the superior occipital gyrus, the middle occipital gyrus, our inferior occipital gyrus, and we have the median longitudinal fissure and the transverse fissure. John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're going to be turning our attention inwards and looking at a couple midline structures. So this is a sagittal section right here, and I know this is a sagittal section because of this structure right here. If you remember what this structure is, this is that corpus callosum, and that corpus callosum is that bundle of white matter tracts which is going to connect our left and our right hemispheres. And that corpus callosum is a very important key landmark for identifying midline structures. So let's just jump in here and get these labeled. So starting with this structure directly above the corpus callosum, so you can see here's the corpus callosum on the image, and then here it is on our real brain. We have a gyrus that's going to be found directly above it, and this gyrus is going to be that cingulate gyrus. And if you follow the cingulate gyrus, it's going to transition from the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe, and then it wraps around and continues as the parahippocampal gyrus as it transitions into the temporal lobe, and it ends right here at the uncus. So this gyrus directly above our corpus callosum right here is going to be our cingulate gyrus. Now we're going to turn our attention to some sulci and fissure found on the medial surface of the brain. So the first fissure we will discuss will be the one found between the cerebral cortex right here and that cerebellar cortex. And if you remember this from your notes, this fissure right here, well, that's going to be our transverse fissure, as you can see highlighted in green right here. So once we find this transverse fissure, directly at a right angle, we have this sulcus right here. And this sulcus is going to be found between our parietal lobe anteriorly and our occipital lobe posteriorly. So based on that location and those names, we know that this is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So right here is that parieto-occipital sulcus, and it's a lot more prominent and easy to visualize from the medial surface compared to the lateral surface. So again, there's that parieto-occipital sulcus, and then if we go at another 90 degree to that parieto-occipital sulcus, we're going to have this sulcus right here. And this sulcus is found solely within our occipital lobe, and this sulcus is the calcarine sulcus, and the primary visual cortex area is going to be found surrounding that calcarine sulcus. So we have our calcarine sulcus right here. Amazing. Now that we've identified all these, let's go in here and label our image. So again, we have our cingulate gyrus right here, directly above that corpus callosum. Next up, we have that transverse fissure right here between the cerebellar and cerebral cortex. Then finally, we have our parieto-occipital sulcus as well as our calcarine sulcus. Let's just verify these one last time. We had that cingulate gyrus, transverse fissure, parieto-occipital sulcus, and our calcarine sulcus. John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're going to be taking another look at the medial structures of the brain. You can see again we have that sagittal section exposing the midline structures. We have our corpus callosum situated right here. We're going to be breaking that corpus callosum down into its individual segments, as well as looking at some other structures, specifically areas within the parietal and occipital lobes. So whenever I'm looking at a sagittal section, my attention is always drawn towards this midline structure, that corpus callosum. And our corpus callosum is actually divided into 4 separate regions. We have the rostrum right down here. Next we have the genu, and genu is French for bend. So you can see this has a bend right here. And then we have the body of the corpus callosum, which is this long, slender portion right here. And then finally, we have this little bulb at the end. This is known as the splenium. So from starting anterior and moving posterior, we have the rostrum, the genu, the body, and the splenium of the corpus callosum. Now we're going to discuss the cuneus and the precuneus. So the cuneus is going to be located superior to this sulcus right here. If you remember what the sulcus is, this is going to be that calcarine sulcus. So our cuneus is going to be located just superior to that calcarine sulcus right here. And its anterior limit is going to be made up by that parieto-occipital sulcus right here. So our cuneus is going to be found within our occipital lobe, superior to the calcarine sulcus, and posterior to that parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, if we go anterior to that parieto-occipital sulcus, we have the precuneus right here. And the precuneus is named per, meaning in front of, the cuneus, which is found back here. So the precuneus is bounded posteriorly by that parieto-occipital sulcus and anteriorly by the marginal cingulate sulcus right here. And it's found just on top of this structure right here. This is that cingulate gyrus. So our precuneus right here is going to be the medial portion of that superior parietal lobule. So now we're going to go just inferior to this calcarine sulcus and identify this gyrus right here. This is going to be our lingual gyrus, and it's going to be inferior to that calcarine sulcus and posterior to that parieto-occipital sulcus. And then finally, if we look right here, so this is going to be that temporal lobe wrapping around. And we have this little nubbin right here. This little nubbin right here, well, that is going to be the uncus. And the uncus is the extension of that parahippocampal gyrus. So right at the end of that parahippocampal gyrus, we have this little nubbin right here, and that's going to be our uncus. This is where we're going to have the hippocampus and the amygdala. And this is all continuous with the cingulate gyrus, which turns into the parahippocampal gyrus, which then comes down here into that uncus. All right, so now let's just get these labeled. First up, we have the rostrum, genu, body, and splenium of the corpus callosum. And then we have the cuneus back here and the precuneus just anterior to it. And then finally, we have that lingual gyrus as well as that uncus down here. Now, just to verify everything, we got that rostrum right here. We have our genu, our body, and our splenium. We then have our cuneus and precuneus, as well as the lingual gyrus and the uncus. John here from Anatomy Bootcamp, and in this dissection we're going to be taking a look at some of the features of the cerebral cortex viewed from an inferior aspect of the brain. So first, we need to get ourselves oriented. This is going to be the right hemisphere. We're viewing it from an inferior aspect. This is the entire cerebral cortex. This is also viewed from the inferior aspect. And you can see in this image, we still have our cerebellum intact, whereas in this image, it has been removed just for some context purposes. So let's start anteriorly. So this is going to be anterior, this will be posterior, this will be lateral, and this will be medial. And same with this image over here. So we know that found most anteriorly, we're going to have that frontal lobe, and that frontal lobe is going to be this orange structure right here. Coming over to our specimen, here is going to be the boundaries of our frontal lobe. And then moving just posterior to that, we have this blue lobe right here. And this blue lobe, that's going to be our temporal lobe. as you can see right here, and some of it has been cut off because it's tucked underneath of our cerebellum right here. And if this cerebellum was removed, then we'd be able to see the occipital lobe like we can see in this image right here. So now we're going to jump into the temporal lobe and take a look at some of the gyri viewed from an inferior perspective. So starting most medially and working our way laterally, we're going to have these two structures right here. This purple structure, this is going to be our parahippocampal gyrus. And just at the end of that parahippocampal gyrus, that's where we're going to find our uncus. It's like a little bulb right at the end of that parahippocampal gyrus. And if you remember, the parahippocampal gyrus is actually continuous with the cingulate gyrus. So that cingulate gyrus wraps all the way around and then comes back here and turns into that parahippocampal gyrus and ends as that uncus. So looking on this image right here, we would have our uncus, that little bulb right here. And then coming back here, we would have that parahippocampal gyrus. And this would be found on both sides. It's a little bit hard to see because we still have that cerebellum intact, but you can kind of get the idea that the parahippocampal gyrus is going to be the most medial gyrus found on the inferior aspect of the temporal lobe. Now we're going to move one gyrus laterally and identify this gyrus right here. This is going to be that fusiform gyrus. And if we look at it on our specimen, you can see right here, this will be our fusiform gyrus. And if we were to move one over, we would have that inferior temporal gyrus found right there. So remember, going from medial to lateral, we're going to have the parahippocampal gyrus and uncus, and then we're going to have that fusiform gyrus. And then if we went one more over, we would have that inferior temporal gyrus. So now let's just get these labeled. We have the uncus, parahippocampal gyrus, and fusiform gyrus. Awesome. So let's just verify these. We got that uncus right there, our parahippocampal gyrus right here, and our fusiform gyrus right there. John here from Anatomy Boot Camp, and in this dissection we're going to be taking a look at the insular lobe, which is kind of tucked deep within inside the brain, as well as some of its more prominent gyri, as well as a functional area found within this region. So let's first start off by identifying it. So this right here is the insular lobe. We would have the frontal lobe right here, the parietal lobe right here, and the temporal lobe right here. You can see a portion of all these lobes has been removed, and that's because it's necessary to remove those areas in order to get a clear visual of the insular lobe because of how it's tucked and situated within inside the brain. So if we look on this specimen image right here, you can see this boundary has been cut away, and this is part of the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobe, and this allows us to expose that insular cortex right there. And just by looking at it, you can notice some unique characteristics of its appearance. We have these long gyri right here, and then a couple of short gyri right there. So these are known as the long insular gyri and the short insular gyri. So the long insular gyri are going to be found posterior in that posterior insular cortex, whereas the short insular gyri, well, these are going to be found anterior in that anterior insular cortex. And you can see here's that clear boundary separating the short insular gyri from the long insular gyri. And then finally, the insular cortex is where we house our gustatory center. So this region right here, within that anterior insular cortex, where those short insular gyri are found, that's where we're going to have that gustatory center right here. So if we came over here, these two little short gyri right here, this is where we would find our gustatory center. So we have the insula, the short insular and long insular gyri, as well as that gustatory cortex. So now let's just confirm these. We have that insular lobe, short gyri, long gyri, and the gustatory cortex. So now let's just confirm these. We have that insular cortex right here. We have our short and our long insular gyri, as well as that gustatory cortex. John here from Anatomy Boot Camp, and in this dissection we're going to be taking a look at the cerebral cortex and some of its features, except this time from a superior point of view. So let's start off looking at the frontal lobe. So if you remember, The boundary, the posterior boundary for our frontal lobe is going to be right here. This is that central sulcus. One way to identify that central sulcus is like on the lateral aspect, how the sulcus doesn't fully extend. On the medial aspect, we can look for the same sort of arrangement. So we have the long precentral gyrus and the long postcentral gyrus, and you can see they're actually connected. So this right here is going to be that central sulcus. So I just mentioned it, moving anterior to that central sulcus, we're going to have that precentral gyrus, and that is going to be outlined right here. And then once we move anterior to that precentral gyrus, we're going to find our superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. And if you remember, you can use the three-finger method to place 3 fingers over your image and outline where the superior, middle, and inferior gyri will be located. But you can see here, we have the superior frontal gyrus, we have the middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior frontal gyrus. Now, if we look for these on our specimen, you can see here is going to be that precentral gyrus. Just for context, here is that postcentral gyrus. Here is that central sulcus. And you can see that the pre and postcentral gyrus are actually attached, and that central sulcus doesn't fully extend even on that medial boundary. So here is our precentral gyrus again. Moving anterior to that, we're going to have our superior frontal gyrus, our middle frontal gyrus, and our inferior frontal gyrus. Now we're going to move posterior to that central sulcus, and we're going to find that postcentral gyrus again. So I had mentioned it. It's going to be right here. And then moving posterior to that, you remember we're going to have our superior and inferior parietal lobules, and that sulcus found in between, that's going to be that intraparietal sulcus. So if we look over here, here is that postcentral gyrus. Here is going to be that intraparietal sulcus. So right here, this would be our superior parietal lobule, and then down here would be our inferior parietal lobule. And now if we go backwards, you can see here is that boundary between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So this is going to be that parieto-occipital sulcus, and back here will be our occipital lobe. So I had just talked about them. We have that intraparietal sulcus right here, which is at a 90-degree angle to our parieto-occipital sulcus found right here. And also, we have along the midline, we have that median longitudinal fissure. So median meaning the middle, we have that median longitudinal fissure right there. All right, now that we've gone over everything, let's label them here on our image. So first up in our frontal lobe, we're going to have that precentral gyrus, as well as the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. Now moving posterior to that central sulcus, we're going to have that postcentral gyrus, that superior parietal lobule, and that inferior parietal lobule. And the superior and inferior parietal lobules are separated by that intraparietal sulcus. And finally, if we move all the way towards the back of the brain, we have that occipital lobe, which is separated from the parietal lobe by that parieto-occipital sulcus. And then finally, separating our two hemispheres, we have our median longitudinal fissure. All right, now let's just verify these one last time. We have that precentral gyrus, the superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, our superior parietal lobule, our inferior parietal lobule, that intraparietal sulcus, our parieto-occipital sulcus, our occipital lobe, and then finally our median longitudinal fissure.